Whether you're a plotter, a pantser, or somewhere in between, there is an outlining technique that's perfect for you. Yes, even pantsers can benefit from an outline. It's just going to look a little different from a meticulous planner's outline. Hi, hello, welcome in. I'm Jerica, and I'm an editor, writer, and all-around content creator, and today we're going to talk about outlines. And more specifically, we're going to look at them through a lens of how much planning you feel you need for your particular writing style. A discovery writer needs an outline that moves and grows with them, while a meticulous planner might have pages and pages of timelines and character sketches and location descriptions. We'll look at 5 general mindsets or techniques for outlining that you can then mix and match to fit your needs perfectly. But first, let's talk a little more about what an outline is, how to use one, and how it may look different for different writers. So why do I suggest that you outline no matter what kind of writer you are? The biggest thing is that I think it's important to get all of the thoughts out of your head and onto the page. And the main reason that I think this is that sometimes we can get caught up in trying to remember all of the things that we've thought rather than focusing on the scene at hand. Even discovery writers tend to have ideas of, the concept of the story, or maybe a couple of particular scenes that they really see, or they have a cast of characters that they're really attached to, but they're not really sure what the story is yet. Even getting just those pieces down on paper can be really helpful for streamlining your process. Something else an outline can do, especially if you're creating a slightly more detailed one, is noticing some of the issues before you get to the writing part. You can see whether or not you have a conflict, if your characters are unique and fleshed out, if you have a solid setting that you know how it works. You have a reason why this story and right now. You have a vibe, a theme, a tone. You get the idea. An outline can help you create a deeper understanding of your story, no matter what point you're at in the idea generation of it. You can change it and therefore help you keep things straight when you do make changes while you're discovering through writing. It can also help keep kind of the minutia straight, things like how you spell characters' names or how you spell locations, what certain people or places look like. I know that I've definitely made mistakes on things like this before. Most recently, I was writing a story about someone named Carol, and sometimes I put an E on the end, and sometimes I didn't, and somebody pointed this out to me. Obviously, it's something I would have caught during editing, but you do end up making weird little mistakes like that, and an outline can help when it comes to the editing stage. You know which one you mean. We've done a lot of talking about outlines now, so I can feel the pantsers starting to panic about having a lot of work to do, or thinking that this video isn't for them, and hopefully you've made it this far, because I promise that it's for you too. So let's look at how these outlines, or the way that you go about making an outline, might look different for a different type of writer. So many people, especially if you're particularly online or you've spent a lot of time in writing groups where people are particularly online, you've heard the words, planners or plotters and pantsers and plantsers and discovery writers and gardeners and all of these different words that's basically talking about the way that you go about creating your story, whether you do a bunch of planning before, or if you find most of the plot and characters as you write. And of course, there's a whole spectrum here, and I'm sure we could figure out some sort of, XY axis too. I'm not really sure what that is, but maybe it's out there. Either way, all this to say that outlines work for the people who don't do a lot of planning just as well as they do for people who do a lot of planning. They just look and work differently. At this point, there's going to be people who are going to start arguing about whether or not some of these things constitute an outline, and I'm going to stop you there. You can have a discussion about it, there's no problem with that. I love getting into the minutia of defining words, but for our purposes, an outline is any sort of written down, tangible planning. So it may not look like a traditional outline, but it is in some way, shape, or form planning your story and or the elements of a story. A panzer's outline may consist simply of a few lines or a couple of bullet points. Maybe it's just a little bit about character and setting and the general vibe or the concept. It might be a very basic plot summary with just kind of a beginning, middle, and end, or maybe even just a beginning and end. It also may be incomplete, waiting for certain parts of it to be discovered. These kind of bare bone notes are still a plan, are still a structure, are still an outline, even if they are just kind of haphazard notes. They still accomplish what I think the main goal is, and that is getting the ideas out of your head and onto the paper so that you don't have to waste brain energy trying to remember them. At the other end of the spectrum, a meticulous planner will likely have pages and pages and documents, and in this case, they may go to the other end of it not being an outline in the sense that they have pieces of planning that people wouldn't necessarily call an outline. A lot of people wouldn't consider the character sketches or the world building document to be an outline, but I'm including it because I think outlining and planning are one and the same. A meticulous planner will have things like timelines, as well as a character sketch for every character, probably even the side characters, maybe even characters that don't show up in the story, but are important for backstory and get mentioned one time. They will likely have descriptions of locations and maps, and maybe even floor plans of the important buildings, or maybe all of them. It really depends on how detailed and how structured a meticulous planner wants to be. And so that's showing a spectrum even within all of the people we'd consider a meticulous planner. And therefore, there is a bunch of room in between those two styles of outlining, and in there is probably what is considered a more standard outline, where you do kind of just look at the timeline and maybe make a couple notes about characters and setting. Most people, when they think outline, they think plot, and that's totally fine. But there's a lot more planning that can be done. This kind of quintessential style of outline probably best fits into the structural technique of outlining that we're going to talk about, where you really just look at the plot points and maybe a couple of other key elements, very often using a story structure to map it out. Within that, they may make more or less notes on some of those other bits, and that's all part of the spectrum. But knowing what an outline is doesn't really help you make an outline, and that's why I want to talk about some of the kind of mindsets or techniques that you can use to create your outline, and ways to kind of mix those two things or ways to kind of mix some of those different techniques together, or use them at different stages of your planning. So for each of these types, styles, techniques of outlining, we're going to look at kind of what they are, how they work, and what it might look like on either end of that spectrum. So structural outlining takes a story structure and uses it as a kind of template for coming up with what's going to happen in your story. This is a pretty simple and pretty standard way of creating an outline, and it's very plot-focused. There's not really a place in structural outlining to talk about characters or setting. That doesn't mean that you can't do them on the outside, but generally structural planning or outlining is very much like a timeline. At its core, you can think about it the same way that we were first taught about making stories, and that is the idea of a beginning, a middle, and an end. You can use just that as your structure. It's very simple, and that is very discovery writer friendly. It leaves a lot of room for there to be discovery as you move through all like those 3 plot points, or maybe you have a couple plot points in the middle, but generally you have that like open availability to work through the writing to get from point A to point B. I do think that this is a style of outlining that lends itself to any type of writer. It doesn't really lean to a discovery writer or a planner. It kind of just works for everyone because it's the standard. In order to do a structural outline, first you need to choose a structure. So your step one is choosing a structure. This could be, a 3-act. It could be the classic roller coaster. It could be Freytag's pyramid. It could be, what else have I done? The 7-point structure. There's lots of other ones. Some of those I've covered in blogs already, and there will be videos coming for them, and there will be other ones as well, but most of those ones were available. Step 2 is to fill in the key components. So if we look at the classic roller coaster, you're going to decide what happens in your exposition, what your inciting incident is, the trials and tribulations of the rising action, the climax, the consequences in your falling action, and then finally the resolution. And you basically just plop in what happens in those, and then you have a timeline. As I said before, a discovery writer is likely to choose a simpler structure, one that has room to move around. So they may choose beginning, middle, and end, or perhaps just beginning and end. They know where they start and they know where they have to get to. The 7-point structure is relatively simple and comes with directions in how to use it. And I'd suggest even the classic roller coaster is generally simple enough for a discovery writer. Sorry, my cat distracted me. I thought he was chewing on quartz. On the other hand, a planner will likely choose a more detailed structure. So something like the 15-beat structure or Save the Cat. Or the hero's journey has more plot points in it. Basically, the more key elements there are to fill in, the more likely, or really just the less likely a discovery writer is to choose it. Not really more likely to be chosen by a planner. A planner will make anything detailed, but that's the general idea. The next style of outlining is very similar. I'm calling it elemental outlining, where you focus on the key elements of a story, which aren't necessarily all plot-driven the way that structural outlining is. This outline offers a wider focus, or rather a wider scope. Rather than focusing on just plot, you will also have spaces to fill in things like character and setting, and maybe get into the nitty-gritty of some of these smaller elements that are kind of like within those. So how it works kind of comes down to how you want to lay it out. But in general, you're going to have kind of sections. You'll have a section for setting, a section for characters, and a section for plot or timeline. Hi, buddy. These can then be further broken down. So you may look at this like a document with kind of like tiered bullet points. You might do a different document for setting and then character and then plot or timeline. You could do this in a spreadsheet, I suppose. And then basically that you're left to your own devices in how you design and store this information and what information you want. However, that's not very helpful, and so I do have a list for each one for some suggestions or possibilities that you may have in each of those elemental sections. So in character, you may have, a character name, occupation, description, and flaws. You might have their narrative purpose. You might have some sort of way to track like who knows or who is related to, or like what relationships different characters have, whether that's like a family tree or a relationship map, or just noting who is friends and enemies of who. Or maybe you have like different factions and you want to note who is loyal to each of those factions, And then speaking of that, the next section would be setting. And you might go into the politics of those factions in that setting or in that section, along with things like culture, the significance of different places to characters, descriptions of specific locations, who might you find in those locations, whether broadly or specifically, maybe like vibe or like emotional, atmospheric notes on different places. Like if you're talking about a particular forest, like is that forest like a dark and gloomy forest, or is it kind of like a bright and cheery forest? And then finally, your plot is, you might end up using a structural timeline within this, but it's going to contain, you know, your timeline, what your conflict is, the obstacles, solutions, and failure. This can also include backstory that isn't actually going to end up in your book, but gives like a good base for everything that's going to happen. Key events, you may have like a timeline for your main plot, but then also timelines for subplots. As you can see, you can be as detailed or as vague as you want or need, and that's kind of like the difference between a discovery writer and a planner in this instance. So let's look at that a little closer. A discovery writer may just have 3 columns and a bunch of bullet points. And it may be just a few bullet points. Under the character, it might be like Jane, main character, blonde hair, speaks with an Italian accent. And then like another bullet point that says Mark, love interest, brunette, loves soccer. Like it might not be like a fully fleshed out thing, but it's enough notes to kind of like keep track of who characters are. And the same for setting and plot. Plot might just have the beginning and the end. It might just have the general concept. It might have like the what if question. It's going to be pared down. Where a planner, a meticulous planner, is going to have like probably a designed document where you can click on a character's name in the plot and it'll take you to the character page. And that character page is going to have name, occupation, all of their relationships. It's going to have their backstory, their physical description. It's going to have maybe even like a little like scene exploration that has nothing to do with what's actually happening in the story. It was just a way to kind of like get the voice of that character on the page, that's referenceable. And then the same thing goes for, you know, if they're writing a political intrigue, they're going to have a page for each faction. They're going to have a list of everybody that's in that faction, whether they're in the book or not. And they're going to have the general culture and all of the subcultures within the city, and they're going to have, in setting, they're going to have a setting map, and then little maps of each of the neighborhoods, and then little, like, floor plans of the important buildings in each of those neighborhoods. Again, it really just comes down to the difference in detail. The next technique for outlining I'm calling visual outlining, and this one's very fun, and I also think leans far more toward a discovery writer than a planner. However, I also think that this is a great place to start even for a planner. And you'll understand once I actually tell you what it is. So it relies on a visual representation of information. So I'm thinking like mind map and mood board. That doesn't mean that we're not using words, but they're displayed in a more dynamic way with something like a mind map, or we are using actual images along with words in something like a mood board. So going back to the forest, like you might have this idea that a forest is a key setting in your book. It may be the key setting of your book. And you want to have like a visual representation of the types of plants. So it helps you visualize like a tropical forest versus like an evergreen forest. There's another there's another word for like a coniferous forest, I guess. That's not really what I was going for. Um but you can like see the visuals because generally the leaves on tropical plants versus the leaves on coniferous plants look different, and so it kind of just like helps you with those like visual descriptions in your book. The same thing goes for like general vibe, or maybe you even have like character sketches that are really helpful for uh, describing or just understanding characters. Like if you have like people in like different poses, like somebody who is very bubbly might be in a pose that like shows that, versus like the stoic person who's like sitting just like flat face, like no movement in their body kind of thing. That'll help with like vibe and personality as much as it does looks, and it's all in like a couple of pictures that may not be perfect but give the vibe. This also works really well at like mixing it together with structural and or elemental. So with like a mind map, you might have, a starting bubble for character, setting, and plot, and then have like your arms coming off of those, and then like the like baker you might attach to the bakery. Or you might want to have separate mind maps that don't touch each other. That's also an option. But you can see what I mean by this being kind of a like a dynamic and free form kind of way of thinking, which may scare some of the more meticulous planners because it's not as organized. There's a lot of room for, like the red string to go across, which feels like a little chaotic. It doesn't mean that a meticulous planner wouldn't like it or it wouldn't work for them. It just feels a little chaotic the way that discovery writing feels a little chaotic. And depending on how you make this, if you make it digitally, there's room to like really move things around and show that that connection between different things. So, you can have your little like character descriptions, and then you can move all of those character descriptions into a relationship map. And it's just like it's just very visual. It's very like artistic feeling. Now, the difference between Discovery and Planner does still come down to detail. However, I think the biggest difference is that an outliner is more likely to use this as like an early planning tool, and then take everything that they learn by doing it and move it into a more organized outline. So this is kind of for somebody near like not necessarily a planner, but like I kind of picture them at like toward that end where they kind of like need the discovery of creating this visual map or mood board, but then they need to organize it because it's too much for them kind of thing. So the next one is method outlining, and this one is a little bit different in that it's taking something that already exists as a method and using it. So it's kind of like taking one of the techniques that I've already mentioned and using it, but there are actual methods out there for working through creating a story. I have very little experience with these because I've always been kind of in the one that I use the most, especially in the beginning of planning, is the final one that we're going to talk about. But mind maps come up. I'm kind of in the free form, do it the way that I need to do it right now kind of outliner. So I make like some very organized pieces of outlines, but a lot of it starts off chaotic like a discovery writer. Um, So with method outlining, I do think this one leans the opposite direction from visual, meaning that it leans more into our more meticulous planning writers, because you're so specifically following steps. Uh, where I kind of view a discovery writer as like hopping around things and not following a standardized order, and not necessarily filling in every step even when they do use some sort of structure. So the how it works is you simply find a method and you follow it. So it could be finding a structure and following it. It could be following the elemental structure. It could be finding something that has a specific name. So the two that I found were the bookend structure or the bookend method, where I've actually talked about it, where you know what the two bookends of your book are. You know the beginning and the end, and that's your outline. That's the method. You solidify those two key points, and then you discovery write the rest. And then there's kind of the exact opposite of that, which is the snowflake method, which I won't go through the whole thing, but basically the idea is that you start with like a sentence, and then you it's like a sentence for like each chapter or something like that, and then you expand that to a paragraph, and then you expand that to a page, and then you like take different pieces and you do the same thing so that it's like constantly growing, like the structure of a snowflake. What does that look like for a discovery writer versus a meticulous outliner? I think that really comes down to the method chosen, kind of like structural, where you are choosing a structure or a method that has the detail that you need. A discovery writer is more likely to choose the bookend method, where there are very few details needed to fill out, and a meticulous planner is more likely to use the snowflake method. However, that doesn't mean that a discovery writer can't use the snowflake method, because the snowflake method kind of feels a little discovery writer as it is. You start with one piece and you expand and expand and expand. So technically, it works for everyone. The final style of outlining that I want to talk about is the just right style. Again, I feel like this leans a little toward discovery writing, but doesn't not work for a meticulous outliner because it's all in the detail. So this is kind of like discovery writer light, in that there's no structure to it and you just write things. Basically, the idea is that you get some sort of summary out in any way that makes sense. So it could be like writing like a paragraph of these are the general things and the general vibe of this story. It could be doing just bullet points of whatever you need in whatever order. It could look like a brain dump. It's really just getting all of the ideas out. So the how it works is just start writing, and it doesn't need to be prose. It can be a bunch of sentence fragments. It can be a bunch of bullet points. It can be, you know, I mean, that's kind of the only way. You can add more like visual structure to it by like adding a visual thing to it, where like you might have like a bubble for the things, and then you're just writing all of the things about a character or whatever. So the way that this will look different is in the organization as well as the detail. I expect that a more discovery writer person will use this and not organize the bullet points or anything. It will just be like, okay, like I know Steven needs to go to the shop and meet Julie, and then it might say something about how it ends, and then it might go back to the middle, and the plot will be interspersed with thoughts about who the characters are. It's very much about it's going back to that original goal of just getting the ideas onto the paper so that you can reference them instead of remembering them. Originally I had 3 styles within this. So there's the brain dump, which is the just like get all of the stuff on the page and worry about organizing later if you ever do organize. When it comes to organizing it, you may move it into an elemental or a structural outline. You may color code things, like everything that's a character, you might highlight a certain color, or you might do it by like everything that involves this character, you highlight it that color, or like everything that happens at a certain spot, or every scene gets its own color, like that kind of thing. The next is a summary, which is just writing kind of like more long form, the general story. So it's obviously a very short bare bones of your timeline, as well as notes about your characters and things like that. So like you might have like a paragraph about each character, and then a couple paragraphs about the general plot, and then a description of the setting. And then the final one is the skeleton, which is setting it up kind of chapter by chapter or scene by scene and putting all of the information that you need for each of those into bullet points within those. So it's kind of like creating a timeline, but gives you room for notes on other bits within it. And again, the difference between a discovery writer and a meticulous planner is going to be about how much detail and how organized it is. A discovery writer is far more likely to use the brain dump system, while a meticulous planner is far more likely to use something structured like the skeleton. I hope having a little structure to work from will make your outlining and therefore writing process a little easier. Of course, this is aimed at people writing novels, but an outline can be helpful for any sort of narrative writing. Think short stories, memoirs, travel books, why not? And a final word of advice, just because you have an outline doesn't mean you have to follow it. If you start writing and realize that the outline doesn't quite fit where you need to go now, you've changed something about the character, the setting, the plot, whatever it happens to be, you can just run with that. If you happen to be organized or feel the need to go back and create a new outline, do it. Use the same methods. Or you can wait until you're done and maybe consider a reverse outline, which is a great editing tool. I'd encourage you to go check out the other blog posts or videos that have to do with outlining and planning, particularly anything on a story structure or story elements. There are more coming in both of those series. And as always, if you have any thoughts or questions, please drop them in the comments below and I will be sure to get to you. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed and maybe learned a little something. I had a blast. Catch you next time. Bye. Iggy, I need to be able to see. I need to be able to see. I'm very close to being done. I mean, feed them. Okay. Bless me.